a while now, but I am the project manager for the Midwest Regional Rail Planning Study. And as Chrissy said, starting off, just want to welcome everyone for making the time to join us for this, our third stakeholder workshop for this second phase of the study. And barring something unforeseen, we anticipate this will be our last time getting together before we distribute the draft final report to everyone. So we're looking forward to getting a lot of good feedback on things, presenting kind of where we've arrived at based on feedback that we've gotten from you previously, and see how well we did coming up with a proposal that folks are interested in and feels like reflects the analysis that's been done and the reality of what's out there in terms of how things move forward in developing intercity passenger rail in the Midwest, and see how things go. So starting off, just quickly run through the agenda for today. We'll start off by just recapping the purpose of this study, particularly for those who may be somewhat new to it, and we've done it each time, and it always seems to make sense to just go over what we're trying to accomplish here. We're then going to move into a summary of the feedback that we got coming out of the last stakeholder workshop that we had back in September, some of which we actually heard during the discussion during that workshop, and some of which we heard from folks afterwards by email. Then we're going to move on and take a look at the proposed draft network that we've come up with based on that feedback and the analysis that we've done. That's kind of the big unveiling here, and move from there to look at some of the additional connect analysis that we did to kind of refine the proposal, the scenario reflected in that draft network, actually multiple scenarios, as you'll see, looking at what happens when you try to optimize fares to try to get to certain outcomes, or to try to achieve certain objectives for the network. And then move into a full group discussion, which we hope will be really the lion's share of the session today. We really want to hear back from you all on what we've put forward today, how we end up presenting it in the final report, and really any other concerns or questions or anything else that may be on folks' minds relating to everything we've talked about today. You can move on to the next slide. Just quickly looking at the project team here. As I said, I'm Peter Schwartz. I'm the project manager for this on FRA's side. Joined here, and you'll be hearing from her towards the tail end of this, by Annalyn Smith of HDR, who's both the project manager and leading kind of the documentation effort here, drafting the final report and lessons learned report that will come out of this whole process. And just working our way through quickly, you've heard from Chrissy from Metro Strategies on the stakeholder engagement team, also joined by Mark Barrett with Quetica, who's with us, again, doing a lot of work on our stakeholder engagement. We have Yoav Hagler from DB Engineering and Consulting as a senior strategic advisor there. And let me know if the presentation dropped off for you as well. If you want to put something in the chat, it just, oh, now we're back. Sorry.
I'm sorry, I think I lost my internet connection briefly.
Yeah, so I will say, as we've said previously, bear with us as well if we encounter any technical difficulties. Obviously, it's less ideal getting together virtually than we did during phase one, where we all got together in person, hosted very generously by folks in the Twin Cities and Detroit and Chicago. But we all know how things go when we're doing things virtually, but it's the world we live in right now for the moment. So, and then just rounding things off, though, we then have Alexis, who you just heard there briefly, and who you'll hear from more going forward, and Brandon Williams of WSP, who have been in the lead, really doing the transportation analysis that underpins this whole effort. So we can move on. We can look at address kind of the basic goals and purpose of the study. And at its core, this is all intended to produce a framework for the future development of intercity passenger rail service in the Midwest, looking at coming up with a network that shows how those corridors interconnect with one another, eventually at least coming up with some basic framework for prioritizing the implementation of those corridors or improvements to other corridors. We're also looking at issues related to governance, how decisions would get made within the region during the implementation of this. Now, the Midwest has a leg up on most parts of the country in that you have the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, MWRRPS, that has for some time been playing that coordinating governance role, which many of the states in the region are members of. And lastly, we look, somewhat briefly and at a high level at funding strategies for implementing the corridor. Again, we're talking about this being a long-term visioning process, and going along with that, it's supported by relatively high-level transportation analysis using our Connect regional rail planning tool. It really is analysis at a conceptual level, focused again at not just the individual corridor level, but really at the level of a regional network of interconnected corridors. There's an intent for this plan and the other regional rail plans that FRA has done or is in the process of finishing up to support the development of national rail planning objectives, which was a requirement that originally came out of the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act of about 10 years ago. And the idea is that the output of this effort would then be able to support existing statewide and regional transportation planning processes, for instance, state rail plans and the broader multimodal long-range transportation planning efforts that the states are involved in. And underneath all of it, the intent here is that what we come up with out of this study will help facilitate future planning at a more detailed level, at say corridor-specific level, or looking at some larger kind of specific issues that affect multiple corridors, such as planning for how you get significantly expanded intercity passenger rail service into Chicago and even approaching Chicago. I think there's a couple other things I just want to mention that go beyond what's on this slide that have come up previously and certainly guide a lot of what we've done here. One is that the big focus of these regional rail plans is to look at where there are interdependencies between corridors, where either there are major cost efficiencies to be gained through the coordinated implementation of corridors, or where there are major demand synergies between corridors with the opportunity for passengers to transfer from one corridor to another. And because of that, we really focus on the corridors that seem to demonstrate those interdependencies based on the analysis that we've done. What that means is that there may be, and we'll see this later, there may be many other existing or potential future services in the region that have a lot of merit and are, certainly those that are operating right now, we would never propose are not part of the future, but it's really that based on our analysis, their value is somewhat independent of the other corridors in the network, and thus their implementation or improvement really is the timing of that would be somewhat independent of the development of other corridors in the network. Also, we are not looking to come out of this with, as you'll see in the draft proposed network that we'll show you in a little bit, we're not looking to come out with this with just one solution for everything. We're really focusing on narrowing down what seems appropriate or feasible or reasonable to do to the extent that the analysis really supports that narrowing down. So if we find, for example, that maybe there are a couple of options for, large scale service levels that look like they may work in a given corridor. Maybe it looks like both, a high density service operating on existing rail lines or adjacent to existing rail lines, what we call regional service, may make sense in the corridor, may seem promising. But at the same time, that corridor also looks like it might be able to support, a new high-speed rail line, what we call Core Express. We're not looking to necessarily narrow down to one or the other, but what that does allow us to do is say, well, you know what, this corridor seems to have too much potential demand to simply really realize its promise through the lowest tier of service that we look at, the emerging service, which is lower speed, lower frequencies. So again, it's not necessarily coming up with the one solution for the entire region. It's really about narrowing things down and supporting that coordinated and logically sequenced implementation of the network overall. So we can go on to the next slide, which is really just pausing, a brief pause for questions if we have any. I think we'll only take one or two at this time, just so we can keep our momentum going. But if we don't get to your question, feel free to hold on to it, and we'll certainly get to it at the end during the discussion. And again, you can raise a hand in Zoom or enter something into the chat if you've got a question. So yeah, it looks like we have Jim Matthews from the Rail Passengers Association saying he's got some questions for later, but he's going to hold on to them for now. So with that, we'll move on to just summarizing the feedback that we got from the September stakeholder workshops and some of the feedback that we've received since then. So, first off, we heard pretty clearly, if we want to go to the next slide, that there is a very heavy emphasis on the part of you all, the stakeholders in this, on ensuring that there is a regional balance of the network that's proposed, and really an emphasis on trying to the extent possible to maximize the geographic coverage of this interconnected network where the corridors really are interdependent on one another. And that is something we heard really across the board. I don't think if we heard much, if any, dissent from that objective, and it's very much something that we have tried to incorporate into the analysis that we've done since our last workshop. And really, in particular, this got to ensuring that there was some balance on an east-west basis, because the first couple of options that we presented at the last workshop very much had a skew to the eastern part of the region. So next, we had several folks bring up that they wanted us to consider more flexibility about how Columbus is connected into the network, whether that be via Indianapolis or via Fort Wayne, and they wanted to maintain some flexibility as things actually move forward towards implementation, at looking at either one of those, maybe potentially both of those. So that, again, is something that we very much incorporated into the analysis that we've been doing since we last got together. So next, we heard that folks really wanted to have some flexibility to consider either regional or Core Express service on several of the corridors where there clearly seemed to be a case that either of those two service tiers could have promise and could be appropriate for those corridors, and not necessarily nailing down as part of this effort a specific service tier for those corridors that were a little bit on the fence, but rather allow for a determination on whether or not you're building a new line, or whether or not you're operating over existing rail lines or existing infrastructure, whether or not some of these corridors may actually be a mix of those two, with some portions being built on new rail lines or consisting of new rail lines, and some of them operating on existing lines, or least on existing rights of way. So that's another major thing that we've looked at. And lastly, we heard a lot about how important the visual representation of the network is in terms of kind of telling the story of how what is proposed and what is kind of the focus of this effort, that is the corridors that have the greatest degree of interdependency with one another, fit into the broader context of both the service that is out there today within the region, state-supported service certainly, but also the long-distance service that plays a very important role right now throughout the region, particularly in some of the outlying areas, but also making sure that we incorporate into the visual depiction of the proposal some of the other corridors that may not operate today, but where there are ongoing or past planning efforts, where the merit of those corridors in and of themselves has been demonstrated or at least seems evident, but where those corridors may not have been incorporated into the core of what we're presenting here because their value is largely independent of whether or not other corridors in the region may or may not be implemented or when they may be implemented. So with that, again, we'll break for questions just briefly. I mean, in particular, whether or not there are things we may have missed that may have been on your mind since we last got together. Obviously, some of those we may have actually have independently looked at. Some of them, we're not going to be able to look at immediately. But if you've got anything on your mind, now that, or questions about how we kind of have moved forward at this point. We got one from Jim Matthews, Rail Passenger Association.
Hi, Peter. I said I would hold off. This seems to be the right spot for it. Just very quickly, first of all, just congratulations to you and the team. I mean, we've been along for this ride for a few years now, and you're at the end. So congratulations. It's been a really cool process, and I've been really impressed by it. So thank you. Thank you for all your efforts and working with us as stakeholders. I did want to bring up, when I briefly reviewed the deck that was sent out this morning before we got together, I was a little disappointed that the discussion around larger economic benefits didn't seem to find its way into this deck. I mean, I certainly recognize, because I'm the custodian of a model internally at our organization as well, I certainly recognize that asking at the last minute to include a certain set of variables can just be really hard to do. And that would have been fine, but I didn't even see in the what we heard slide any discussion. And I felt like, at least in our breakout group last month, there was a fairly robust discussion around larger economic benefits and considering the effect of that service on the larger economy, however it's configured.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is there a mechanism, obviously not in this model, but is there a mechanism to include commentary about that, or a note for further discussion, or just some way to get at that issue? Because I do think it's very important.
Yeah, so I'll give a little bit of a peek behind the curtain here of what happened there. So there actually is intended to be a full benefit cost analysis module to Connect, and honestly, it just was not working right. We thought it was going to be available for this, and what was missing in particular, or what the problem that we had with it, was that the user benefits in particular, that is the benefits to rail passengers, were calculated solely on the basis of travel time savings without recognizing that there's actually an economic benefit to situations where people may be transferring from one mode to another, not because the mode they're shifting to is particularly faster or offers a better, more competitive trip time, but where honestly the fares are just much more competitive. And this is particularly true with some of the longer distance or origin destination pairs, where if there's competing air service, you may, certainly with Core Express, you may get close on a door-to-door basis with being time competitive with air, but your travel time savings likely are not massive. But because of the inherent efficiencies of passenger rail transportation, where your per seat cost is relatively low on an incremental basis, you can offer a much lower fare than the airlines essentially are able to offer, so that you're driving mode shift based on fare levels, and there's an economic benefit associated with that. Now, there are a lot of offsetting things, which is one reason why this got so complicated, but that's kind of a long answer for why we haven't explicitly included a quantitative analysis of those broader economic benefits here. That said, we will in the final report very much be including a discussion, as you said, as you suggested, about those broader economic benefits, more on a qualitative basis than necessarily on a quantitative basis. And particularly note that in a lot of areas, those benefits are highly correlated with the volume of transportation that you're providing and the amount of mode shift that you're generating. So obviously options that result in higher forecasts for passenger miles carried by the network would result in greater benefits in terms of highway congestion, in terms of emissions and pollution reduction,
Right.
in terms of just general mobility benefit, all of that stuff. I mean, if people are shifting from one mode to another, they're getting some benefit out of that implicitly, and there are broader economic benefits associated with that. So it's not necessarily that, I mean, honestly, if we had our druthers, we would have included it much more in a much more explicit quantitative way into things, but it is certainly something that we intend to address on a more qualitative basis in the final report that y'all.
I appreciate that. And I have to say, I mean, our own model, we have, the Connect model apparently focuses on primarily sort of benefits to the individual passenger based on trip time. In our model, that is one of 47 factors that our model considers.
Yeah,
so,
it wasn't exclusively that. It was more just that in the reporting, I mean, I'll be perfectly honest. When you look at a lot of passenger rail proposals, if you purely look at travel time savings, you can end up with negative user benefits, which obviously doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But with that, I think we'll probably, I guess maybe we have one more from Laura if we want to get to that one now before we move on.
Thanks, Peter.
Sure, thanks, Jim.
Sorry, I didn't know you were going to call on me.
No.
I just wanted, I was thinking, and I think Jim was trying to bring this forth as well. What about the economic benefits to the communities themselves? That's a large part of what Jim's model, as far as we've seen, the benefits to the, like when they're cutting the long distance service, what that's going to mean for the communities themselves, the economic benefits that they bring to the local communities for that service.
Yeah, and again, that's definitely something that we'll be looking to address again on a more qualitative rather than quantitative basis in the final report. And it's important to note that despite the fact that we hit a little bit of a wall when it comes to the quantitative benefit cost analysis, the intent was to include a broad range of benefits, not just limited to user benefits. And also we saw a quick question I'll just address quickly from Kevin Brubaker about, calculating consumer surplus on reduced travel costs. That's exactly the approach that we're looking to take when it comes to refining, kind of fixing the cost benefit analysis module of Connect, where we got into kind of it being a bit more tricky was one, simply the coding in the model to get it all to work, and then also making sure that we captured the corresponding, not to get too nerdy on the economics front, but capture the corresponding changes to producer surplus as well, so that we're getting both sides of the equation and addressing things consistently. But with that foray into economic nerddom, we'll move on, and if folks have additional questions about this, we will certainly get to them at the end. So, I mean, this is really the main part of things, the big unveiling. Maybe we should have a drum roll or something here, but this is where we are right now as a proposal to include in the final network. So again, a big part of it is trying to maintain the flexibility in terms of kind of refinement of service tier, and in some cases, just basic routing and network configuration that we heard a desire for coming out of the earlier workshops. Also to ensure that we strike a bit better regional balance and kind of geographic coverage by bringing back in the Chicago to Omaha corridor, which definitely brings more service as part of this kind of core network to the western part of the region. Incidentally, it's also consistent with the fact that FRA does have a tier 1 NEPA decision for that corridor, so, and is actually working towards the implementation of the first phase of it between Chicago and the Quad Cities. As you can see, apart from Minneapolis, St. Paul, which clearly the success of that corridor rests on getting trip times competitive with air from end to end, thus calling for core express level of service. The other kind of pillar corridors extending from Chicago to St. Louis, Chicago down to Nashville, Chicago to Columbus, either via Indianapolis or Fort Wayne, and then from Chicago to Detroit, we're all showing as having the possibility of being implemented either at the regional or the core express level of service. And that's very consistent with the analysis that we did. We also are showing that we have 2 options for how to get to Columbus, not necessarily mutually exclusive, but it could be either or, it could potentially be both. But we view it both in terms of what we're seeing in the analysis and in terms of the interests and concerns and positions that we've heard from you, the stakeholders, and from the fact that this is very much a question that kind of focuses primarily on the states of Ohio and Indiana above all others, that probably should be left somewhat open until one is able to do some more detailed corridor specific analysis. Also, you'll see that we did our best to really include all of the existing service in and all of the services that either have been subject to earlier planning or ongoing planning work, along with some other potential interregional connections that we've discussed previously. You can see extending down from Nashville to Atlanta, and all the connections that extend beyond the region that exist today in the form of long distance services. And we've really tried to make this as all-inclusive as we could, as we could think of, try to include everything that came to mind. But certainly if folks think that we have left something out, please feel free to let us know, and we'll make the necessary adjustments. And this is something that we certainly like to get your feedback on as we move forward. And I think it's important to note that in terms of what is shown in the kind of dashed gray lines, we, as I mentioned, that encompasses existing state-supported service, existing long distance services. And in terms of kind of planned services, they run the gamut from some that we actually have NEPA decision documents on. The NLX service between the Twin Cities and Duluth is a good example of that, all the way to services that are perhaps a little more than just a glimmer in folks' eyes, but certainly are at the very early stages of planning. For instance, a connection between Kansas City and Wichita, and some others that you can see here. So with that, we'll actually move on. I'm going to turn it over to Alexis Howland to walk us through some of the Connect results for different permutations essentially of the map that we just looked at, kind of looking at, given the flexibility that the map allows, what the performance of the network looks like if you go to one extreme or another. So with that, take it away, Alexis.
Thanks, Peter. Right, so in September, we heard feedback regarding geographic coverage, the routing to Columbus, and then the option to implement regional or core express service on some of the corridors. And we went through a process of testing different network iterations that then led to the proposed draft network, which we just showed you. So these corridors that I'm going to walk through are the ones that sort of fed into that draft network. So for reference, this is the previous draft network from phase 1, but the data here are the outputs from the connect run with the updated database values, the updated auto trip tables from phase 2. So you can see here in the previous draft network, there is an annual ridership of 19 million with annual passenger miles of 5.4 billion, generating 1.5 billion in revenue each year. And this network costs about $141 billion to build and about $2 billion to operate annually. And these are just comparison figures when we look at the other networks that we've tested. So this is option I, which we actually showed in September. So this will look familiar to you. A quick clarification is that there were some modifications in the connect runs for this model or for this network and the next one that we adjusted just to make sure that all the networks were consistent with each other. So these figures have been updated slightly just for your reference if you were to look back at the September networks. So in option I, that this network has significant core express coverage, as well as now service included to Omaha. Columbus is accessed via Indianapolis, and Indianapolis acts as a hub with connecting corridors to Cincinnati and to Nashville. The annual ridership in this network is greater than in the baseline network, and passenger miles and revenue are also significantly greater, as is the average trip length. So suggesting that in this network, there are more longer trip passengers than in the baseline. The annual O&M costs are somewhat less than the baseline O&M cost, but capital cost is greater. Overall, this network has an operating recovery ratio of almost 1.3. So it is generating an annual surplus of about $500 million. Now, option J was also reviewed in our last meeting, and this network is the same structure as option I, except most of the Core Express corridors have been stepped down to the regional service tier, with the exception of the Chicago to Twin Cities corridor. Compared to the baseline, this network actually has somewhat lower annual ridership, but slightly higher annual passenger miles. The annual O&M costs and the initial capital costs are lower than the baseline network, and the operating recovery ratio is close to 1. It's at 0.97, so the annual revenue generated almost covers the annual operating and maintenance costs. And that is a significant improvement over the baseline operating recovery ratio, which is 0.75. So next we explored the connection to Columbus via Fort Wayne, and we went through a similar process of looking at Core Express connections and then regional connections, similar to how we just did that with option I and J. So in option K, we see the connection to Columbus goes through Fort Wayne, and we have a predominantly core express network overall. This option has more ridership than the baseline network, but it does not actually match the ridership estimates for option I, which has the connection from Columbus via Indianapolis. However, it still has a very good operating recovery ratio of 1.23, so it's generating an annual operating surplus of over $400 million.
So Alexis, J and K are similar, but just different core express versus regional.
Right, so option I and J have sort of the same skeleton structure. So the corridors have the same geography, but they are different in terms of core express and regional service. So option I and J have the same structure, but different service tiers. And then that is the same for option K and then L, which I'm about to talk about. So they have the same structure, but with option K, there's more core express service, and in option L, more regional service. So with option L, this again, we see the connection to Columbus via Fort Wayne, but in this network, the only core express corridor is to the Twin Cities. Of the 4 corridors that we just walked through, so I, J, K, and L, this one actually has the lowest annual ridership. However, it also has fairly low annual O&M costs, so the operating recovery ratio is pretty close to 1. It's at 0.94, so it is able to generate annual revenue that almost matches its annual operating costs.
And before we move on to the next slide, just one thing just to clarify. So essentially these 4 options we just reviewed, I, J, K, and L, have essentially 2 degrees of freedom in them. One is the routing to Columbus, either via Indianapolis or Fort Wayne. And the second is about service tier, whether parts of the network are core express versus regional. One thing to note is that on the service tier front, these represent the extremes, essentially, that in reality, that map that we looked at earlier could be implemented in a way where all of the teal colored corridors were core express, or all of them were regional, or even within individual corridors, some portions of them may be core express or regional. But we did want to capture essentially the furthest out extremes there so that we could look at kind of what the breadth of potential performance of that network would be when taking those kind of more extreme assumptions on the outer ends of the spectrum.
So here we have what is hopefully a somewhat familiar table to you, where we compare the outputs for these different network runs and do a standard deviation analysis to show their performance relative to each other. And we've also outlined in a bold or black line some of the key metrics. So this first box just shows demand metrics. Then we have capital cost bolded, operating recovery ratio, and the annual O&M surplus or loss are indicative of operating financial performance. And then finally, at the very end, we show sort of long-term efficiency metrics. But across this table, what you'll see is that option I generally performs significantly better than the other options in terms of ridership. However, it does have a significantly higher capital cost, but it does have the best operating recovery ratio, so it's generating the greatest annual operating surplus. Option L has the lowest annual ridership and just to remind you, option L is a more regional network with the connection to Columbus through Fort Wayne. Option I is a more core express network with the connection to Columbus via Indianapolis. So option L has sort of the lowest annual ridership of these networks, and it also has the lowest operating recovery ratio outside of the baseline network or the draft network from phase 1. But it also has one of the highest net present values, while option I has one of the, sorry, yeah, option L has one of the highest net present values of the networks that we just looked at.
And, the reasons that we're focusing on, kind of what rises to the top on certain metrics, what rises to the top on some other metrics, is what we'd like to present, in the final report is a range essentially of possible performance metrics for the network that's represented by that map, depending on how it ends up getting implemented. And based on looking at this, it does seem like, and as you'll see, as Alexis moves forward, that I and L kind of represent the upper and lower bounds there. And as she'll walk us through right here, you can see that a little bit more explicitly.
Right. So this table ranks each of the networks based on how they perform for each of these metrics. And you can see kind of across the board that I rises to the top of the columns for many of the outputs, in particular with the operating efficiency and the demand metrics. And then option L tends to be towards the bottom of the columns with those same metrics. So I and L seem to represent sort of the poles of the performance for the networks that we considered, which leads into the next part of our analysis, where we did a fare sensitivity and frequency optimization analysis, which was something that we also did in phase 1 with the proposed draft network then. So as we just described, we kind of identified option I and L as representing the poles of the scenarios that we considered. So we were going to complete this analysis on these two networks. And the purpose of this was to test how fare modifications impact ridership and revenue. Generally, reductions in fares lead to ridership increases and revenue decreases. However, the ridership increases are disproportionately greater than the revenue decreases, particularly for the core express networks. And then after we adjusted the fare, we optimized the frequency to account for particularly high or low load factors. So if we reduce fares, quite likely ridership would jump up, which then means that maybe we need to add trains to accommodate those riders. And we adjusted the fares and the frequency with the intention of approximately matching an operating recovery ratio of about 1 for each of the networks. In addition to that, in phase 1 with our previous proposed draft network, it had an operating recovery ratio of about 0.88. So with option L, we also went through an optimization process where we matched that operating recovery ratio, since previously there had been some willingness to have a network where the revenue didn't necessarily cover the operating expenses. We put together a network that sort of matched that performance level. So on this slide, in the table, you'll see in the first column that's labeled default, this is the option I outputs before any of the optimization. And then in the second column, you'll see it says 50% fares. So we globally adjusted the fares down by 50%, which led to significant ridership gains. So you'll see that annual ridership increased by 63% to over 33 million annual passengers. And the passenger miles increased even more. They increased by 70% to just over 12 billion annual passenger miles. This did lead to a decrease in revenue of 17%. So after we adjusted the fares, then we modified the frequency, in this case mainly adding trains on some of the high performing corridors to handle the added ridership. And that meant that the annual operating and maintenance costs did increase somewhat, so they go up by about 6%. And overall, this network at these settings, or these levels, has an operating recovery ratio of just over 1. But through these modifications, you'll see we were able to increase ridership by over about 13 million annual passengers. So with option L, so the more regional focused network, it already had at the default settings an operating recovery ratio that was pretty close to 1. It was at 0.94. So we didn't do any global fare adjustments. We just optimized the frequency on some of the corridors, which brought down the annual operating and maintenance costs somewhat. And so through that, we were able to bump up the operating recovery ratio to 0.97. You'll see, so there's some slight reductions in ridership, a reduction in annual O&M costs, and we get an operating recovery ratio that's almost 1. So the revenue here almost covers the annual operating and maintenance costs. And then lastly, we explored matching the operating recovery ratio from the phase 1 part of the study, which was 0.88. So with option L, what that meant was we globally reduced fares 30%. So they are at 70% of the default values, which led to a ridership increase of 28%. So adding about 5 million annual passengers. Passenger miles increased by 34% and revenue decreased by 8% with the reduced fares. And then we went through the same frequency optimization process. And the overall operating recovery ratio of this network is 0.87, so very closely matching the operating recovery ratio from phase 1. All right. Sorry, I'm just looking. I saw that we got some questions in the chat.
Yeah, why don't we hold off to address some of those at the tail end? But rest assured, we got those noted, and those will be the first we get to during the discussion.
Yep. All right, so I'm gonna hand the presentation back to Peter.
So, Alexis just walked us through, some of this fare sensitivity analysis that we did. And really, each one of those options can be viewed as, almost a separate alternative where we're varying the fare levels based on varying objectives for the performance of the network. So, for example, one objective might be to have the maximum operating surplus possible. Another one might be to maximize ridership subject to the network overall, essentially breaking even on an ongoing operating financial basis. And then a third one may be, to maximize ridership and even be willing to support the operation of the service financially on an ongoing basis if it's determined that the increase in ridership that you can get by keeping fares a little bit lower may be worth whatever public support to the operation that those lower fares would essentially require. So moving on to the next slide here, what we've essentially got in front of us, as I alluded to before, is we want to establish essentially what we pin down as the high end of the range and the low end of the range of what this network as represented in this diagram could represent. We've kind of established that options I and L are the high and low in terms of the geography of the network and the basic service tiers. And the variable that we've kind of added in now really is that fare level. So if we go to the, and this is something we were looking for your input on. We want to know really what you all think the most realistic or most advisable way of portraying the range of potential performance of the network would be. Which of these objectives are more important or would be better to kind of pin us to in establishing the range that we present in the final report. So, looking at a table, again, this summary table of the results of these various fare sensitivity analysis runs with the standard deviations overlaid on them. We can kind of walk through what these various things represent. So that first row there, option I with the default fare level, is really one could see as an option that maximizes the ongoing operating surplus. And this estimate, well, with everything Connect, we take the absolute values essentially with a grain of salt and try to focus more on comparing runs against one another. Looking at over $500 million annual surplus is nothing to sneeze at. And there may be very good reasons to optimize for that. For example, one could bond off of that projected surplus and use bond funding to help finance at least a portion of the upfront capital costs for implementing the service. Similarly, that kind of potential operating surplus could be a means of attracting private investment, which in turn would, through whatever mechanism, would be able to finance at least a portion of the upfront capital costs in exchange for that ongoing revenue stream. We then move on, to the second row there, where, assuming the geography and the service tiers that are reflected in option I, we're looking to essentially maximize ridership, maximize use of the service subject to breaking even. And, what we found, and breaking even being represented by an operating cost recovery ratio of 1. And what we found is that if we did a number of runs, essentially sequentially cranking down the fare levels on a global basis by 10% increments, we found that at 50% of the default fares in Connect, we got very close to an operating cost recovery ratio of 1.0, and we saw those very significant increases in demand. And there are a number of reasons, certainly from an economic perspective, as we were talking about earlier, why one might choose to do that. Obviously, the more demand that you divert from other modes of transportation, the greater non-user benefits you have the potential to generate from the system overall, which may be particularly important given the very substantial upfront capital investment that implementing a network like this would require. Skipping past the third row there and going to the fourth, which those two are very similar, just with a bit of optimization of the frequencies. This essentially represents that primarily regional network in this case, going to Columbus via Fort Wayne, but optimize to try to get towards that magic number of an operating cost recovery ratio of 1, or as close as we could get to that. And again, compared to the primarily core express options, represented in the option I cases, we're seeing significantly lower ridership and use of the network. There's no doubt of that, but at the same time, significantly lower upfront capital costs, which then translates into net present value, looking at capital and operating together over I think we use a 20-year life of the network that is substantially better for break-even primarily regional network than it is for the break-even primarily core express network. You can see about negative $100 billion net present value on a purely financial basis. Just to make it clear, this is not taking into account non-monetized, non-captured economic benefits, but simply looking at capital costs, operating maintenance costs, and revenue as the basis for these NPV figures. We're looking at about negative 100 billion for option L versus negative 140 billion for option I. That's similarly optimized to essentially break even. And then at the bottom there, we see an option where we look at reducing fares to try to drive up the use of the network significantly, and essentially set as our target the same operating cost recovery ratio that we arrived at the conclusion of our work during phase 1 of this study, where there seemed to be an appetite among the stakeholders to consider something that might require ongoing operating support if that ongoing operating support would translate into significantly greater use of this system and all the benefits that come from that. And what we see here is that for that 10-point decrease in operating cost recovery ratio, which equates to about $170 million a year, we see pretty significant increase in use of that network with the same, assuming the same service tiers and the same basic geography, about a quarter more ridership and a third more passenger miles. There's one thing that is kind of interesting here that's worth mentioning that may have popped into some folks' heads, which is how are these fares established, and how in particular do those two scenarios, the second row and the fourth row, where they both are trying to target breaking even, compare to one another. So the fares in Connect are essentially service tier dependence and are based on, broadly speaking, the fare structure for existing intercity passenger rail services in the country. So Core Express uses a formula. It's not strictly a fare per passenger mile, but it's somewhat more complex than that. But it uses a formula that's basically based on the fare structure of the Acela Express service in the Northeast. The regional uses a formula based on the fare structure for the regional service in the Northeast, and the emerging uses a fare structure that's based on kind of the average fare structure for state-supported corridor services throughout the country. But even with that, what we found is if you look at option I with 50% fares and compare it to option L at 100% fares, they both more or less break even on an operating basis, but the actual fare level for the option I at 50% is about half that of option L at 100%. So if you just do the math, we're looking at about 15 cents per mile fare for option I at 50%, and about 26 cents per mile for option L at 100%. And in a way, this sounds kind of counterintuitive. Option I has, broadly speaking, higher service levels, faster trains, faster trip times, increased frequencies than option L, and yet passengers on average would be paying substantially less on that option I network than they would for option L on the option L network. So essentially paying less for better service. And it might cause one to kind of scratch one's head, but it's driven by the fact that with more of the corridors at Core Express, you are getting significantly higher load factors and higher utilization of the service compared to the available capacity. And a lot of that is based on the fact that with shorter trip times, corresponding with faster trains, you are getting a lot more demand from origin destination pairs that are greater distance apart. And as a consequence of that, you're getting much higher utilization of the trains and much higher load factors on the somewhat further flung portions of the network, essentially the further reaches of some of those corridors that extend out from Chicago. That comes with a price though. So you might say, hey, this is Goldilocks, more demand, cheaper fares, still not requiring any operating support, but the kicker is the upfront capital cost, essentially, that if you want to get to what seems like a kind of Goldilocks scenario, you're going to be paying a lot more in terms of upfront capital costs. Again, looking at that second row and the fourth row, we're looking at $160 billion versus $116 billion, so close to a 50% increase there. And what we're seeing as well is that it doesn't really pay for itself necessarily with increased revenue. When we look at those NPVs, we still have the primarily Core Express network having a lower NPV than the primarily regional service, just because those upfront capital costs loom so large. On the other hand, if your objective is truly to be as efficient as possible, at least by one measure, looking at what the net present value of the financial demands of the network are versus the amount of demand that it's generating, option I at 50% fares is at the top at negative 38 cents per passenger mile. Versus the corresponding fourth row there, option L at 100% fares at negative 59 cents per passenger mile. So there are clearly some trade-offs here. I know what I just walked through might have been a bit of an earful, but I think it's important to kind of see where these trade-offs are, that there are trade-offs between capital cost and the volumes that you generate. There are trade-offs between ongoing operating support and the demand you're generating. And, all of these arguably are important considerations, not just in how the network gets implemented, but also in terms of how we depict the network in the final report in terms of that high and low range. So we can go to the next slide here. There seem to be kind of two clear options for representing the range, at least as we saw it. One is to say, we're going to peg to that operating cost recovery ratio of 1, that we want to represent things in a way that shows them as the network is not requiring ongoing operating support, but still maximizing the amount of demand that network generates subject to that constraint of not requiring operating support. So, that gets us to a high end of the range, arguably, at least in terms of demand and really across the board in terms of capital costs as well, of option I at 50% fares, and then a low end of the range represented by option L with 100% fares. If we go to the next slide, the other kind of what we saw as obvious or kind of natural coupling would be to say, hey, listen, we want to represent a range that actually shows the operating financial performance as being variable. And we're not going to peg it to just breaking even, and that at the high end, we'd represent something that actually shows a significant operating surplus. That is option I with the default fares, 100% of their default level. And then a low end showing what happens if we say want to have a more modest capital investment and have things skewed more to the regional side, service tier wise, but we still want to maximize ridership to the extent possible, and we're willing to eat a certain amount of ongoing operating financial support in order to get that higher ridership. I don't think we are going in here with a particular opinion on what would be best, but it's certainly one of the things we'd like to hear from you about in terms of what makes the most sense of actually reflecting in the report that, you know, memorializes all this work, and you know, what kind of is most, what folks feel makes the most sense, both kind of from a technical perspective, but also obviously a lot of this is about perception and in how this report gets perceived in terms of the promise and kind of the roadmap for developing intercity passenger rail in the region. Certainly that was one of the big messages we got coming out of our earlier stakeholder workshops, and it's something that clearly is relevant in how we just depict the quantitative outputs of all the analysis we've done. So, you know, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anna Lynn to guide us a little bit through the group discussion. And before we get to some of the questions that have been trickling in over the last half an hour or so, just look at some of the basic questions that we had that we'd like to hear from you about.
All right, so yeah, on the next slide, we've kind of, before going into the session, we're like, what do we want to get out of this from the stakeholders? What do we want to hear from you as your kind of parting remarks in this, and how we depict this? And as Peter said, what's the perception of this going to be and how we want to depict this moving forward? So basically the rest of our session this morning is to go through this, go through these questions on the screen, go through the questions on the chat, and come away with our kind of our parting remarks here as we go back and then pull together our draft report summarizing these efforts and kind of the next steps, which is, we've heard a little bit about that and how we want to be able to move forward with this. So in terms of the map itself, we came up with some initial questions to guide the discussion, and then we'll go to the chat. So in terms of the level of detail that we have shown in the map, we heard before we wanted to see kind of the understanding where the services might terminate or connect to, understanding the services that are already in existence. Do any folks here that are on the session today have any comments in terms of the level of detail and where we are, what we're showing, and is there anything misrepresented, or is it too much detail? Is there too much going on the map?
I have a question. I really like the better detail on the western side.
Mm-hmm.
But I just typed this in. I'm wondering if there's any consideration that could be given for looking at another hub in addition to Chicago, say Minneapolis or Kansas City, thinking about those as smaller regional hubs, and really giving better consideration to that rather than the way that this still could be interpreted as, oh, by the way, you could throw these in. And also, you know, like I had put this comment in to you previously, but looking at the whole connection between Wichita down to the south has a whole potentially explosive economic benefit to it. And that's really not illustrated in this at all. I mean, connections to the south, you know, you have Nashville, but that's more to the east. And think about Texas, you know, think about Oklahoma, you know, all those, and then, you know, connections from there. So there's not a Southwest study going on now, but it's just, you know, and then of course we don't have you don't have any kind of real study going on that's the upper West. What Washington or upper California would bring to or Oregon, would bring
Right.
east.
The Pacific Northwest. I know that's as consultants, we were always hopeful that, yeah, South Central through Texas or a Northwest, the Pacific Northwest would come to fruition as next steps, mimicking what was done for the Southwest, California, Arizona, Nevada, and then, the Northeast quarter, then the Midwest here and the Southeast, which is also wrapping up. So these two together. So point well taken that it does go beyond and in particular, the kind of the Southwest connection and looking beyond Wichita. Peter, and your thoughts in terms of, further representing kind of the beyond, we tried to capture that with Los Angeles, but maybe there is more of a Southwestern or South Central focus that we would want to, I do see we have that coming from St. Louis, with the Texas reference. It could be potential to
well, the
fill
Wichita
that
connection is a direct, that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a connection to Dallas and Fort Worth, and it's Oklahoma down to Dallas, so it's connecting to the existing Heartland Flyers. So that's going to happen one way or the other. It's a priority for our the states. It's a priority for Amtrak, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that's one thing. And then of course the upper part of it as well. I've always wondered what it might look like to study, Minneapolis, St. Paul as a mini hub, which is somewhat illustrated here, but not in a robust fashion.
Yeah. And I see it from a connect standpoint. You're right that everything does come in, it does appear to very much a hub and spoke system funneling through Chicago, and that's just the nature of the connect tool. But I would think in future, and Peter, correct me if I'm wrong here, but let's, think about in future planning efforts that the Twin Cities or St. Louis or other areas could potentially be further analyzed and connect beyond the reaches of this effort.
Yeah, I think that there are a few things there, Laura, that you mentioned. I think in terms of the visual representation, I think you mentioned that the connection from Wichita south. That's something that, given the interest and some of the work that's been put into that thus far, may be worth adding to the map here. The issue of other hubs within the region beyond Chicago, I think it's important to say that certainly from FRA's perspective, one of the things that we came into this with as one of our big interests was looking at the possibility for exactly that, for having hubs elsewhere in the region other than Chicago, where we would see those kind of synergies between the corridors that connect at those hubs, to have something, a little bit more grid-like, even potentially, than simply hub and spoke oriented, particularly given that much of the work that's been done to date and the service that operates today is very much hub and spoke oriented. What we did find, though, just kind of following where the analysis led us, is that we did test looking at St. Paul as a hub. We did test, looking at Columbus as well as a hub as part of phase 2. And particularly when we looked at some of those hubs where the corridors that would be connecting there may be relatively shorter, that even in phase 1, there didn't seem to be the level of interconnectivity between the services coming together at those hubs that kind of raised it to the level of being included in the final network, essentially. And what we saw as part of phase 2, which as folks may recall from the earlier workshops, was really precipitated by a revision to the auto trip tables that seemed very necessary, that get into the demand forecasting and underpin a lot of the analysis we did here. That the revised auto trip table had, particularly in the forecast year of 2055 that we use as the basis for all this analysis, a relatively greater emphasis and higher volumes of longer distance trips as opposed to shorter distance trips, where we actually saw the new trip table reflecting a pretty marked reduction in the forecasted shorter distance travel volumes in the region versus what we had in phase one. And again, that also kind of further eroded some of the analytical evidence supporting having more regional hubs. We still have some options here. Indianapolis, certainly with extensions to Cincinnati and Nashville, and also to Columbus and Dayton, should things, that be the way things head. There's very much a potential there, but the analysis just didn't point us in that direction when it came to, the St. Paul, Minneapolis hub, which we looked at explicitly earlier, and even, St. Louis, we looked at, I believe, and a few others. And, again, it's not that those don't necessarily have merit, but that we do feel like we need to draw some bounds around this too, including things that most clearly demonstrated those interdependencies and those kind of synergies that really, represent the whole reason why we were doing a kind of regionally focused study rather than corridor by corridor studies in the first place. The last thing, that I heard there, and it's something that's been a theme throughout these discussions, is a concern that by focusing on kind of discrete regions, we're downplaying the importance of interregional connections. And I think that's a completely valid concern. And really, it just has to do, I think, more than anything, at trying to establish kind of a workable scope to bite off pieces of this effort to do kind of long range planning for intercity passenger rail development in the country as a whole, which really was the genesis of doing these regional rail plans. And, our hope is that even as we continue to do these types of regionally focused plans elsewhere in the country, that will also be able, as a parallel but complementary effort, to look at interregional connections explicitly, because it is artificial to say that somehow travel just stops at Pittsburgh, or travel just stops at Nashville or at Kansas City or Omaha or the Twin Cities, because that's not the case. And in many of these places and in many regions, there are major travel markets that extend just beyond the kind of artificial border that we establish for the sake of kind of manageable scope of analysis that could really drive demand and be extremely complementary, that are worth looking at. But we see that as kind of a separate effort of interregional study, essentially, as opposed to this in particular, which was very much focused on the 12-state Midwest region.
Yeah, but we could, in the report, be very intentional about saying those kind of things.
Oh, absolutely.
And even having a map, that says further additional regional studies in other areas of the countries need to occur. It is possible that, and we could do that. There are other hubs that could be considered in the future, such as Minneapolis, St. Paul, such as, I would say, Kansas City versus St. Louis, but either one, that those might be looked at in the future and be intentional about that. Even circling potential hub, or for the future, or something like that, that gives some kind of a vision. I mean, 2055 is a long time. And I think we want to be understanding our limitations right now, but also be open enough and visionary enough to say, there's more to come.
I think that's a really good point, and it kind of gets to the whole, again, a theme that we've talked about a lot throughout this process of wanting to avoid a situation where the report coming out of one of these regional rail planning studies risks being interpreted as being the end all be all of everything, and anything that's not included in it is off the table. And I think, as you said, being very explicit that, you know, there is a role for intercity passenger rail service in interregional connections, and, you know, even being able to, you know, show that visually in some way and saying, you know, it's outside of the scope of this report itself, but it's still a big part of the picture, would be really important. So that's a great comment, Laura. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
I see one more question in here that relates to kind of the map, and then we'll flip over to talking about the network structure and the ranges. And this comes from Sean at Rail Passenger Association, liking the interregional connections, but it seems a mistake to represent the existing long distance corridors and future corridors using the same map coding. And so, yeah, it is something that I know that we should give a little bit more thought to for the final report purposes. And Peter, I was thinking through this one, I'm like, well, we definitely would want to show a map separate from this one that includes the existing long distance and state supported services, so a reader can understand that. And it's just when we have this one map coming together, what makes the most sense in terms of, you know, too much information, or making it clear to understand what is the existing long distance corridor versus what is potentially a new service. Peter, on if you have any further commentary on that one, or if Sean, if you would, you know, further expand on your question there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my own perspective, you know, the aim here was to make sure that we showed, you know, we showed the full universe of what we believe may be operating within the region in the future. And I definitely understand that, you know, showing a bit of a conflation between you know, these routes and the extensions beyond them by the long distance service, the extension beyond the outermost points, essentially, may cause some confusion there. I think it's something we're just going to need to think at, because I don't think it is necessarily the intent. And I mean, we've said from the outset that the configuration of the corridors, the individual corridors included, you know, in this map in the colors, the yellow, purple, red, and teal, that those are corridor configurations that the CBSAs, you know, the cities that are shown there are considered to be kind of corridor defining. So these corridors really are intended to serve those metropolitan areas in order to, you know, realize their potential and kind of serve their purpose, but that the exact routes that they may take is not specified necessarily. And, you know, similarly, it may be the case that even though, you know, today the Texas Eagle operates, you know, on the old Alton down to St. Louis, that if a Core Express route between Chicago and St. Louis were to be constructed as well, that's not to say that a long distance service would shift onto that new infrastructure. You know, there is the potential, I guess, Sean, what you're getting at, for some parallels, particularly where we have the potential for new rail lines, essentially, to support Core Express service. I mean, I guess my concern would be that kind of showing things more explicitly in terms of routes and whatnot, and the potential for parallel routes on some of these legs might confuse things more than clarify, but it's definitely something that we can think about.
Yep.
Well, I guess all I'd add to that is these routes have, you know, these existing routes have political patronage. They have coalitions that are built around them. They will be the vehicle for near-term investment, and for the public, they are the things they actually ride. So I think it's a good anchoring point visually for people to understand exactly where this future corridor, this future network relates to their lived experience. So, but your points are well taken.
Interesting service. Okay. Thank you. All right. So let's pivot over. There's a bunch of questions in the chat box related to the service tiers, related to some of the metrics that we established. So we'll start at the top. We have about a half hour or so to go through these. And any other comments that come to mind, either type them in the chat or raise your hand or chime in at the appropriate time here. So starting from Jim Matthews, following up from one of his earlier questions, asking about Chicago-Cleveland, why is that not a core express route, and the fare basis. And we did talk about the fare basis in terms of core express and being the Acela, or mimicking, pivoting off of the Northeast corridor, and the regional being more of the Northeast regional services, and then the emerging being along the lines of a compilation of the state-supported services across the country. But in terms of selecting Chicago-Cleveland and not having that as a full core express route, you can see on this map here, we do have it as regional core express between Chicago and Fort Wayne. But just in terms of the switching to regional between Fort Wayne and Cleveland, Alexis or Peter, in terms of the specifics of why that was not continued all the way as a core express, or in the teal color at least.
Yeah, sure. So it was mainly just a decision based on the function of ridership, and also revenue to a lesser extent. But so the connection to Chicago to Cleveland, we didn't see the as great of ridership gains when moving from regional to core express as we did with these other corridors, where with some of them, for example, Chicago to Indianapolis, when it moves from regional to core express, there are significant ridership gains, which can potentially help justify the cost of the more expensive service. And we just in Connect didn't see the same ridership benefits when moving from regional to core express.
And yeah, I think it's important to note that this, the proposal as it stands right now shows at least the Chicago to Fort Wayne leg of the Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh corridor as potentially core express. So gaining the potential to gain some trip time improvement by having at least part of that be core express, and in particular, the portion that might be shared with service also coming up from Columbus. So you get some economies of scale from that. I think it may be worthwhile, again, this gets into kind of how we caveat or describe things in the final report, to say, first off, that, FRA, I think it's our position, believes that as things move forward, it makes sense to periodically revisit these regional rail plans to reflect, changes that may happen in the transportation market. I mean, certainly right now, I think for those of us involved in actually project level planning right now, there's a lot of uncertainty right now in terms of the intercity transportation market, but there is even, absent the context of COVID and the effects that it's had. I think the other thing that may be worth saying is that, in concert with this idea that complementing these regional rail planning studies should be studies looking at interregional connections, that once you start looking at the potential for interregional connections, you may find that some of the conclusions reached in a study that kind of looked at things more narrowly at a regional level may need to be revisited, because, for example, for Chicago, Cleveland, and even on to Pittsburgh, if you start looking at things interregionally and you start looking at Philadelphia to Pittsburgh to Cleveland and whatnot, maybe one determines that it makes sense to bump up the service tier to core express to try to gain some time competitiveness on some of those much longer distance origin destination pairs. Great.
We have a comment here from Kevin. It mentioned just saying that by cutting the fares in half, we see a net present value per passenger mile that's almost twice as good, and definitely of interest here. In other words, spreading the very large capital cost over more passengers leads to a better outcome. Agree. That's quite clear and something that we would highlight in the final report. And if folks here concur, I mean, that's one of the we're looking at high versus low and preferred considerations moving forward, that would be, if that's a value, the net present passenger value, net present value per passenger mile as being one of the strong defining metrics here.
Yeah. And it helps illustrate some of the trade-offs here. You can drive down that metric if you're willing to spend more upfront on capital costs. But again, one can't necessarily just treat, funding for upfront capital costs as something that's going to rain down from heaven without any, consequences or any sacrifices. So, I think that's going to be a key part of how we kind of tell the story in the report of this somewhat flexible network map, that there are different directions one could take with it, but each direction involves different trade-offs.
Yep. Question from Mayor Berger. Option L, was it evaluated for ridership at 50% fare levels? If not, why not? Since the 50% level, which is like we did for option I, drove significantly higher levels of ridership.
And, the reason we did not go, and I believe we did do runs bringing it further down, to 60 and then 50% of the default fares. We really kind of wanted to put something of a floor, though, on the operating financial performance. And the floor we chose was essentially the same floor of operating cost recovery ratio that we as a group kind of accepted and coalesced around as part of phase one, which was, fares or fare revenue covering approximately 87% of the operating and maintenance costs. What would essentially happen as you drove fares lower, you'd see some increase in ridership, obviously, but you can continue to see erosion of revenue. You would also, in some cases, see a need to actually operate more trains to accommodate that additional ridership, which then drives up your operating and maintenance costs. And, you just see further deterioration of operating performance below the floor, financial performance that is below the floor that we thought was kind of reasonable. I mean, we thought even in and of itself, some might argue that putting forward a proposal that would require ongoing financial support for operations may already be a bridge too far, that, the floor may be better set at breaking even. But we did want to show at least some of that trade-off between operating financial support and demand, but didn't want to take it to an even further extreme. The reason we went to 50% for option I was that we could go down to 50% of the default fare levels and still hit that magic cost recovery ratio of 1. So that it gave a little bit more wiggle room just because of the efficiency of the network when more is developed as Core Express, at least on an operating basis. You just see higher load factors, higher utilization of the services that are actually operating. So you get essentially more revenue even at lower fares for relatively fixed operating costs.
And Peter, just quickly for clarification, that's the 15-cent level?
Right. Roughly 15 cents per mile. It was the 50% for option L. And, I just got that by, dividing the revenue by the passenger miles, get you your average fare per mile.
So Kevin had a question in terms of what if we looked at the network and fares, and what would it look like if it was designed to maximize net present value per passenger mile? So is that, looking at, we have some of the highs here, Peter, and I'm looking at, maybe option I, and having, what would that network look like, and how would we, is it worth an effort, or what would that impact be in terms of our metrics here?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what it boils down to in terms, if we're kind of accepting the geography and the service tiers as represented by option I and L, you try to maximize net present value per passenger mile. Probably what you're looking at is just continually driving down fares, more or less. I mean, I think the argument could quickly devolve into, the arguments which are valid about, the efficacy of free public transportation in urban areas. There is an argument to be made for it, although it is what many consider to be kind of an extreme position. And I think one of the things we'd essentially run into as well is that, these demand forecasting models, generally speaking, are calibrated to kind of function within a range of values for many of the inputs. And I would certainly be concerned that once you start really driving fares down way below anything that exists today, really, in terms of intercity passenger rail service or even long distance common carrier transportation, passenger transportation generally, we may end up seeing implied sensitivity to fare changes being somewhat greater than it may be in reality. I mean, essentially things showing that you just keep pushing fares down, you're just going to get more and more people to take it. And, there are some situations where that can be true. It just depends. But yeah, I think my own feeling is that in terms of MPV per passenger mile, we have a pretty good representative range, shown on this, ranging from -38 to -60 or -59, really, if we discount that, or -62 actually, if we look at option I with 100% fares. I mean, it's definitely a question. What would happen if you simply optimized on that? I guess I would have concerns about the validity of the actual outputs when you start taking things to really far extremes.
If I could add to that comment a little bit, I mean, I recognize the limitations of your model, and I recognize the political desirability of not requiring ongoing subsidies. But if we're talking, pure business case or pure economics, the real question is, what benefit do I get per dollar of public investment, right? We've talked about, operating surpluses, offsetting capital costs. Those are trivial. I mean, none of these generate enough operating surplus to make more than a rounding error difference in the capital cost. And I would hate for us to go too far down that path when, in my opinion, the net present value per passenger mile balanced against the political reality of how much capital can we raise is really sort of the right metric here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. Yep. So in terms of looking at the highs and lows and understanding if we have the right ranges, comments from the stakeholders, where we have how do we define the high and the low network range? I know we have the one slide that goes through where we're looking to define that and what makes sense. Does what we have in the slides here, looking at slides 32 and 33, where we start to highlight what those are. What does everyone think about, defining the poles, as so we say? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Are you expecting to depict those ranges in the report?
Certainly for some of those metrics, kind of a high and a low. And, I think we're still aren't at the point of exactly deciding which of those metrics end up in the report and which ones, we may be a little bit more circumspect about. But, I think it would be helpful to hear from you all, do we want to have the report essentially depict a range that pegs things to the service breaking even, or as Kevin was arguing just now, that leaves the door open, both on the upper end and the lower end for what may be done with fares with respect to operating financial performance. On one hand, relatively higher fares, relatively lower demand, but a operating surplus, which could serve some purpose in terms of financing the upfront capital costs potentially. And then on the low end, the trade-off of saying, hey, if you don't mind eating some amount of ongoing operating support, you can actually get substantially greater demand out of it, even at a relatively more modest level of upfront capital investment, which is what would be represented by the bottom row there. And I think the big question for you all is, do we want to kind of take an expansive look at the range, or do we really want to pin it to trying to break even? These pairings kind of look logical to me, the second and fourth row, and then the first and the last row being those two pairs. But maybe there's other directions we could take. But it'd be great to hear from you now. But if you've got thoughts you want to share with us, following this, our ears are open. They don't close just when the webinar ends.
So this is Rick Harnish. If I could go, I think that having a range is a really good idea, but I really want to question basing this on Northeast Corridor fare structures. I think that Amtrak has made a huge mistake in charging such high fares and essentially driving most of the market to buses or the automobile. When I have checked comparative distances in Europe versus here, the high-speed train tickets tend to be what Amtrak is charging in the Midwest for their low-speed service. So it's, Milan to Florence is the same distance as Chicago to Springfield, and the ticket prices on Italo are about the same as the ticket prices on Amtrak. Mm-hmm. And but they have a lot more seats and a lot more frequency, so they're driving a lot more volume. And it seems to even be a better business case, period, than charging high fares and just having really short trains like they do. So I would really like to see a different type of description on fare ranges and break it away from the Acela and regional service on the Northeast Corridor.
Yeah, Rick, I mean, personally, I share your view on that. Passenger railroading is a volume business, and artificially keeping demand away by charging high fares doesn't necessarily serve a great purpose, either from an economic perspective or in some cases even from a financial perspective. And that it is because of that we baked in this fare sensitivity analysis into things. Now, it's a little bit of a blunt tool for it, global adjustments in fares. In this case, we did them by 10% increments. But certainly, the option I at 50% fares was intended to address that precise issue that, these fares may just be so high as to just be driving away demand in a way that is disproportionate to the savings one realizes as a result of, improved operating financial performance. So, I think we've tried to incorporate that. What that might, one might argue is that maybe the range one shows is the second row and the bottom row, both of which show, relatively lower fares. But, it's there are a number of different ways one can kind of cut at each one with its benefits and its drawbacks.
Trade-off. So I think that the discussion we've had here, Peter, that translation of, well, what does this really mean? I think that will be helpful to document in the final report, just so, if you're coming at this report cold, you will understand that, what 50% of what or 100% of what. So we can be sure to document that. Yeah. We're pulling it together.
And, in we're heading into about 10 minutes left in our scheduled time. If we can flip back to the Q&A discussion sheet there. I am wondering, we've had some discussion about, the high-low range and the level of detail. I am wondering if anyone has a little bit about concerns over the network structure, but, I'm curious if anyone has heartburn over specific elements of the structure that we're reflecting here, or just about the general approach of having, a proposal that allows for a little bit more flexibility going forward and how service tiers or even, in one case, the basic structure of the network is defined. Again, we thought that there was a benefit to give that flexibility, given that the analysis wasn't necessarily pointing us in the direction of ruling everything out except, one option. But I'd be curious if there are differing opinions on that or other concerns that may have popped into folks' minds as they've looked at this over the last half an hour, 45 minutes or so.
And Peter, can I ask? I'm kind of directly to you state DOTs. We have a number of you on, and this is for you.
Laura, you're breaking up a little bit on my end.
To hear some of your thoughts.
Right, any comments from the DOTs?
Can you?
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit, but basically you're looking for comments from the state DOTs on the choices or the flexibility that we're showing within the teal and other aspects of the corridors for the full network. Okay.
I can comment from Illinois. Basically, what's really depicted here reflects what's been reflected in our state rail plan and everything like that. So it seems pretty accurate, at least from an Illinois perspective.
Okay, good.
Helpful, Elliot. Thank you.
And this is Sam Tuck with IDOT. I concur with Elliot just 100%. So exactly on point.
This is Vanetta Keefe from NDOT. Right now, for NDOT does not have, we lost our service, as everyone knows. So we can always use a tool like this for when we move forward with funding. But again, for us, and I'm glad that you've broken this out, a major concern will be cost.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be great if we could tap into a third party who had a private party who was interested in advancing passenger rail, and that would be able to balance the minimal amount of money that we would get from the state and any money from the feds for infrastructure. So again, for us, it's really good to look at options and have something that the FRA has produced. Actually, we have used the prior Connect documents. We've used those in conversations with our executive staff. So this is a document that we are absolutely going to use, but our stumbling block is investment, coming up with the investment funding. So if anyone knows a billionaire who's interested in who has an interest in passenger rail in the Midwest, if you could just give them my telephone number or her, or give them my telephone number, I appreciate it.
Will do, Vanetta. No, that's helpful to provide. Yep, go ahead.
This is a run from WISDOT, and yeah, I think the approach you're going with in terms of showing a range with all of these different metrics and flexibility is definitely the way to go. Similar to what Vanetta said, I think on just the political side, the operating support issue is a big one. And so showing a range and putting that in perspective with all these other measures and everything, yeah, I think is the right way to go. I do have a couple other questions and comments, but I can email those. Who should I email those to?
Yeah, to Peter, to myself, Annalyn, Chrissy. We have our contact information will be on the last slide, but yeah, we'll be soliciting comments.
And Arun, any comments you send, can you CC me too?
Sure. Yep.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking for next steps, you know, like what we're going to do at the regional level to further discussions and to have more, you know, specific discussions on once this report comes out. So we need to be prepared for that in some respects, and we need to tell people that there's going to be a lot of additional discussions at the state levels.
Moving forward. Yep. All right, any final comments or questions before we transition over to our next steps? We have about 3 minutes here.
Yeah, why don't we look at kind of what the next steps and with all of this.
Yep. So we're keeping with our trend of 2-week comment periods, and so we request any comments. So Arun and others, please send us your comments by November 10th. We'll be putting together a draft final report based on these comments. We do have a report started, but we need to incorporate all of this phase 2 analysis into the report. So we'll share that with stakeholder planning group and provide a comment period of 4 weeks. And looking to, depending on the extensive amount of comments that we receive, to put forward a final report this winter in the December-January timeframe. So we're coming to the finish line, right, Peter?
Yeah, no, we certainly are. And, you know, I'd say of all the topics that we've discussed today, you know, I think the one that would be the most helpful to hear from you all on, if you've got additional thoughts, is really how we kind of represent the range in our approach to it. Because, you know, what we put forward as numbers tells very, you know, different stories and illustrates the trade-offs differently. And I think one other thing on the table is, you know, maybe it makes sense not to just pin it to a range. This is just for the sake of argument, not to pin it to a range of just high and low, but actually just look at some of these options and the trade-offs explicitly and say, you know, you can keep the fares relatively higher, arguably suppress demand, but generate some operating surplus that could, you know, generate some investment into the upfront capital costs. Or, you know, you could keep the fares much lower and potentially sign yourself up for some ongoing operating support, but see greater demand, you know, essentially looking at what all the trade-offs are. But you know, there's obviously a risk of complicating things too much and whatnot, but we'd really, really love to hear from any and all of you who have thoughts on that, you know, not just on what your preferences, but kind of what your rationale behind those preferences are, because that's one where I know we do not have the answers right now. And, you know, we want to make sure that however things are presented, that we take into account, you know, folks' opinions on it and all of the trade-offs that come with one approach versus another.
Yep. Now I'll add, Peter, we have all the chat box discussion from today. We have that captured. We'll be considering that as well as we put together the final report, as well as the recording and the Q&A discussion that we went through today.
Yeah, and I'm just as a final thought on the range, I'd like to hear back from people about the thought of a high and low, and then something in between, at least as you know, various options, not just the high and low.
All right. Well, we're right at 11 o'clock Central right now. So again, the last slide here has our contact information for myself and Annalyn and Alexis, feel free to contact any or all of us with your comments. We all talk to each other. We all share the stuff back and forth. But just want to thank everyone again for participating both today and throughout this process. It's obviously been a bit longer of a process than we had originally anticipated, but we feel pretty confident that the time we spent on it will end up being worth it and getting a stronger, more accurate portrayal of things reflected in the final report. And, you know, as I said, I think this will be our last time getting together live like this in all likelihood. And the next thing that I think you'll be hearing from us is a draft of the final report for your review and comment, as Anne outlined earlier. And, you know, with that, wish you all good rest of your day, rest of the week, and you'll be hearing from us in a month or so with that draft final report.
And Peter, before you all go, I'd like to just say on behalf of the states and MWRRP, we so appreciate all the work you've done and really want to commend you for listening and for being flexible. And thank you. And we, as I mentioned, we at the state level need to come together and think about how if there's ways that we want to comment as a region back on the report and things like that. So we'll be in touch with all of you on that end.
All right.
Peter, I'd like to just add rail passengers. I mean, we said it at the beginning, but I do think it's important here in a public forum to congratulate you on the team for everything that you've done. And it has been a multi-year process, and the degree to which you have worked with us as stakeholders and taken our input and shaped the outcome. I think it was terrific, and I think you're to be congratulated for that. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jenna and Laura. That's very kind of you. And yeah, as we said, this is a collaborative effort. You know, this is something that cannot be done in isolation by, you know, all of us here in Washington. And you know, I think what we're going to end up coming out of this with is a product that all of us who have been involved can see our fingerprints on, can see our influence on, and, you know, hopefully something that can really guide things in the region going forward. So thanks to everyone for your all's contribution. It couldn't have happened without everyone, you know, putting in the effort that you all have put in over the last few years.
All right. Thanks again.
Well, thanks again, everyone. And, you know, look forward to hearing from you with any remaining comments or thoughts. And you'll be seeing that draft report from us in the next month or so. Thanks again.